if you're willing to put in just a little bit of time, effort, and maybe like 30 bucks worth of your money, you will be able to turn this PC from this uncut gemstone to something that's worth showing off to all your envious relatives. Gemstones, when they're put on a necklace or a ring, they're sparkly, shiny, and beautiful. But when you pull them out of the ground, they are very much not that way. Oftentimes, they're dirty, misshapen, rough, and uncut. And to take a gemstone from that to worthy of being put on a ring or a necklace or a bracelet or your chain, it takes a lot of work. And the cool thing about that is you can add so much value to your gemstone without adding anything to it. In fact, you actually end up taking away a lot of it, but even then, the value skyrockets. Well, the same type of thing tends to happen with flipping PCs. They'll throw together a build that'll perform great and has the underlying value that the customer is looking for. But at the end of the day, it's still this raw, uncut PC that's not very pretty to look at. Make sure to stick around to the end so you can see how I add value to my gaming PCs without spending a ton of money. So let's start off with the first, cheapest, and most obvious thing when it comes to your PC: cable management. Cable management can make or break the aesthetic of a build, but don't worry, I'm going to teach you guys how to achieve that clean, tidy look that all these professionally built PCs have. It all starts in the back. Your system needs to have good bones as far as the cable management is concerned. And what do I mean by that? Well, for starters, you have to have your front panel wired up nicely, and you have to have your 3 main power supply arteries put in the right spot. And what do I mean by the power supply arteries? Well, we're talking your CPU, your GPU, and your 24-pin motherboard power cables. If you can get these in the right place and make sure that they're out of the way for the rest of your small cables that we're going to get to in a second, then you can assure that you won't be able to see any of that mess from the front, which will keep your PC looking exactly the way that you want it to. Now, each person tends to cable manage in their own way. Here's how I do it. I like to start with the front panel. I like to move it out of the way and either run it down the middle or run it down the left side of the case. Now, for the 24-pin motherboard, I like to come up the middle. With the CPU cable, I like to come around to the right of the PC, usually tucking it into that little crevice that's there. For your GPU cable, I like to tuck it up from the bottom because it gives it a nice curve that we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes. Make sure when you're doing your front panel that you figure out where exactly you want your USB 3.0 and make sure that you route your audio and your USB 2.0 headers through the right place. What do I mean by that? Well, a lot of motherboards have 2 USB 3.0 ports. Sometimes your motherboard will only have one and it will usually be in one of those 2 places. Wire it how you see fit. Usually I like to tuck it underneath the 24-pin motherboard cable and bring it up on that side, but it's your call. For your front panel and audio, make sure that you route them on the right sides of your case. The front panel audio is going to be on the left side of your motherboard, whereas the USB 2.0 will be in the middle or on the right. So make sure that you route those underneath accordingly. Now it's time to route the fans. Tuck your CPU cooler fan cable underneath the CPU cooler or behind the motherboard, whichever one is easier or looks better. Now, for the case fans, do your best to hide them on the way to the back, and once they're in the back, try and route them along where the main arteries of your PC are. Now, do the same thing with your RGB cables if you have any. This will help you keep your PC nice and organized in the back and will let you unplug and replug stuff in as needed and diagnose your issues a little bit easier. Now, for every other cable that I missed, route it as you see fit and as you think is needed. The biggest thing is to try and make sure you can't see any cables from the front of the case. Now, look at that difference. Without cable management, it's pretty ugly and a little bit messy, and as soon as we managed those cables, we cleaned it up by a ton. The PC just looks a lot tidier. Well, now that our cables have been managed, I see a small issue. It's a pretty simple problem, really. There's these ketchup and mustard cables that look pretty ugly. Now, simple problems oftentimes require simple solutions, and this one's pretty easy. It'll probably cost you between $2 and $5 in about 30 seconds of your time. So run to your local hardware store and grab yourself some electrical tape. Match it to the color of your build. For this one, we're gonna be doing black. Now, tape over those hideous colors, and voila, your PC looks a little bit tidier, and you're on your way to that beautiful aesthetic PC that you've been looking for. Now, before we get on to this third thing that I do, I want to ask you to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the content. I've also got a Discord which you can feel free to join because, hey, it's free and I think you'd have fun chatting with me and some of my friends who are also interested in PCs. Anyway, on to the third way that I add value to my PCs without spending a ton of money. This one can cost anywhere from like $8 to $20 and it just depends on how you want to do it. And this one is spray paint. Wait, you can't spray paint PC parts, that's stupid. Well, actually, yeah, you can, and you do have to be pretty freaking careful, but it can really elevate the look of a build if you do it right. Spray painting things like your GPU shrouds or your CPU cooler shroud, if you're using a stock AMD cooler, can really just elevate the look of your build and can tie it all together in a way that you don't really get from anything else. Now, this is easily the most time intensive of the things that I do, so make sure you set aside about an hour to an hour and a half to do this one. We're gonna use a GPU as an example, but you can also do this with a AMD stock cooler, like I mentioned a second ago, and that's a little bit less time intensive. So to spray paint a GPU, the first thing you're gonna do is take it apart. This is pretty simple, and each GPU that I've taken apart usually only has between about 8 and 20 screws. All you gotta do is make sure that you keep track of those and don't lose them, because most of them will only go into their same sized hole, so it's not a huge deal if you mix them up a little bit. Now pull that shroud and heatsink off the backplate of your GPU. If your GPU has a plastic or metal backplate, you can also pull that off. There's gonna be a couple screws on the PCB of the graphics card, which you can undo, and that will pop right off. Now for the shroud and heatsink, every GPU manufacturer does this a little bit differently, so the big thing that I have to say is make sure you separate the cooling fins from the actual plastic shroud, and make sure you separate the fans from the plastic shroud. If you spray paint over the cooling fins, your graphics card's gonna run hot, and you're not gonna see the performance that you want, and the aesthetic value will have been wasted. And same deal if you paint over the fans, because they're not gonna work as intended, and they're not gonna be able to keep your graphics card cool. Now this next step is optional, but I like to do it because it adds an extra element of depth to the paint job that I do. Grab yourself some masking tape and a sharp pointy thing. I usually use an X-Acto knife because it does a pretty good job of cutting painter's tape. It's almost like it was made to do that. Anyways, mask off whatever you don't want in the build. Now grab yourself some high grit sandpaper or even your kitchen sponge and start scrubbing. If you're using the sponge, use the green part. It does a pretty good job of getting rid of that clear coating that's on almost every plastic thing that you're gonna have that keeps the plastic clean. If you don't get rid of this coating, the paint's not gonna stick to your plastics the way you want it to, and you'll end up with fish eyes and little bubbles in your paint, which you don't want. So make sure to do a good job at this. Now, using some Windex, some rubbing alcohol, or even just some water with a microfiber cloth, make sure you wipe this entire thing down. That's gonna get rid of any little plastic bits or any fingerprints or oil that you've left on there. Now it's time to paint. Grab yourself some cardboard or find a surface that you're cool painting on and start painting. Make sure you do really light coats, especially at first. You don't want to overdo it. For the first coat, I like to do it to where I can barely see the base color. And then I do 2 or 3 more coats of that same thickness before applying a clear coat that I use. Now that clear coat definitely isn't a necessity. I just use it because I think it does a good job of making whatever paint you used look more matte, and that usually fits with the aesthetic of the build a little bit better than a gloss paint would. There's a couple pointers I have for anybody trying to actually paint their GPUs. Make sure you hold the can about 6 to 12 inches away from your subject and apply light, gentle coats. Move at a consistent speed and make sure you layer over every little bit of it multiple times. Now let that coat dry for 20 minutes and go back and add the rest of your coats, spacing them out about 20 minutes each, especially if it's warm outside. Then wait for your paint to cure. That can take anywhere from an hour to a day, depending on the temperature and the air humidity. It's a whole thing. Once it doesn't feel tacky, then you can go ahead and reassemble that GPU. Make sure you clean the GPU die and the heatsink of any thermal paste and add some new stuff to it. Now, make sure you get that GPU put back together and look at the difference it made. It definitely added just a little bit more spice to this build that we're trying to throw together. Now, spray painting your parts tends to do a really good job of adding a color scheme to your build. And you know what else does an excellent job of adding to that color scheme and just giving it that final chef's kiss? That would be cable extensions. That's right, this is my favorite thing to add to PCs because it makes every PC that I build look about 100 times better, especially if you keep good cable management and don't have those ugly ketchup and mustard cables sticking out the bottom of your case. Now, these cost more than pretty much anything I've mentioned so far, unless you get a bunch of gear for spray painting, but they also do the most for the look of the PC, I think. For this specific build, we're going with some red and black ones to match with the rest of our build thus far. Now, take a look at this before and after. See what I mean? They really just add this je ne sais quoi, this chef's kiss that you can't get from pretty much anything else, especially with those hard vertical and horizontal lines with the motherboard's 24 pin and the GPU's 6, 8, or however many pins you're using. It also has this cool 3D curve effect that I was talking about a second ago that really just makes the PC feel a lot more alive and a lot more like tangible. I don't know if that makes any sense, but it does in my head. Anyways, if you can't tell, I absolutely love cable extensions. They do so much for a build and can take a meh looking build to a whoa looking build. They can turn your uncut gemstones into something that everybody's going to be envious of.